The sharp crack of a door slamming echoed across the wheat fields of Salida, Colorado, and Delilah Ashford stumbled backward down the porch steps, her hands shaking as she clutched the letter that had just been thrust into her palms. Thomas Welford, the farmer she'd been courting for nearly 2 years, stood in the doorway with his mother beside him, their faces set in identical expressions of cold finality. The year was 1874, and the September sun beat down mercilessly on Delilah's back as she tried to process the words that had just shattered her entire world. "I cannot marry barren ground," Thomas had said, his voice flat and emotionless. "My mother spoke with Dr. Hendricks. He told her about your condition. A farmer needs sons, Delilah. I need sons to work this land. What use is a wife who cannot give me children?" The letter in her hands was from the doctor, confirming what she had feared for months after a terrible fever had ravaged her body the previous winter. The illness had left her damaged inside, the doctor had explained gently, and the likelihood of her ever bearing children was almost non-existent. She had confided this only to Thomas, believing that their love was strong enough to weather any storm. How naive she had been. Delilah walked through the dusty streets of Salida with her head down, aware of the whispers that followed her. In a small town, news traveled faster than a wildfire through dry grass. By evening, everyone would know that Thomas Welford had rejected her, and they would know why. She was damaged goods now, unmarriageable, worthless in the eyes of a community where a woman's value was measured by her ability to bear children and keep a home. She reached the small boarding house where she had been living since her parents died 3 years earlier. Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor, was waiting on the porch with her arms crossed over her ample bosom. The look on her face told Delilah everything she needed to know before the older woman even opened her mouth. "I heard what happened," Mrs. Patterson said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that brooked no argument. "I am sorry, Delilah, truly I am. But I run a respectable establishment. I cannot have unmarried women of questionable prospects living here indefinitely. You have been paying reduced rates because Thomas was planning to marry you, but now I need that room for a family coming in from Denver next week." "Mrs. Patterson, please," Delilah said, hating the desperation in her own voice. "I have nowhere else to go. I can work more hours at the general store. I can pay full rates." The older woman shook her head. "Mr. Hutchins at the general store already sent word that he no longer needs your services. His wife thinks it inappropriate for you to be working there now that your situation has become known." She paused, then added more gently, "You have until Friday to find other arrangements. I truly am sorry, child." Delilah climbed the stairs to her small room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at her hands. 3 days. She had 3 days to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. The savings she had put aside for her wedding trousseau would last perhaps a month, maybe 2 if she was extremely careful. After that, there would be nothing. That evening, she walked to the edge of town where the Arkansas River cut through the valley, the Sawatch Range rising magnificently to the west. The mountains had always brought her peace, their permanence a reminder that her troubles were small in the grand scheme of creation. But tonight, even their beauty could not ease the ache in her chest. Thinking of jumping in? Delilah spun around, her heart hammering. A man stood several yards away, leaning against a massive cottonwood tree. He was unlike anyone she had seen in Salida before. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore buckskin pants and a worn leather vest over a dark shirt. His hair was long, falling past his shoulders in waves of deep brown, shot through with gold where the setting sun caught it. But it was his face that held her attention, ruggedly handsome with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of beard, high cheekbones, and eyes that were a startling shade of gray-blue. He looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves, all hard plains and raw strength. "I was not planning to," Delilah said stiffly, embarrassed to have been caught in her moment of despair. "I was simply watching the water." The man pushed away from the tree and walked toward her with an easy, confident stride. As he drew closer, she realized just how large he was, not just tall, but powerfully built, with muscles evident even beneath his clothing. There was something almost overwhelming about his physical presence, like standing next to a force of nature. "Nainita." "Name is Pierce Quinlan," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. I have been trapping up in the high country for the past few months. Came down to trade my furs and restock supplies." His eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "You look like someone who just had the world pulled out from under her feet." "Is it that obvious?" Delilah asked bitterly. She had not meant to say it aloud, but something about this stranger made her feel like she could be honest. Perhaps it was because he had not been in town long enough to hear the gossip yet. Perhaps it was because he looked at her like she was a person rather than a disappointment. Pierce shrugged those massive shoulders. "I have seen that look before. Worn it myself a time or two." He gestured to a fallen log near the riverbank. "Want to talk about it? Sometimes it helps to tell a stranger. No judgment, no expectations." Delilah hesitated, then found herself walking to the log and sitting down. Pierce settled beside her, and she noticed he was careful to leave space between them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, she found herself telling him everything. About the fever that had left her barren, about Thomas's rejection, about losing her room at the boarding house and her position at the general store, about having nowhere to go and no prospects for the future. Pierce listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, but his eyes attentive. When she finally fell silent, he was quiet for a long moment, watching the river flow past. "Thomas Welford sounds like a fool," he said finally, "and a coward to boot. Any man who would cast aside a woman he claimed to love because of something beyond her control is not worth your tears." "Easy for you to say," Delilah replied, surprised by the flash of anger that rose in her chest. "You are a man. Your worth is not measured by your ability to produce children. I am nothing now. No one will want me. I will end up in some workhouse or worse." Pierce turned to look at her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You are wrong," he said quietly. "Your worth has nothing to do with whether you can bear children. Any man with sense would see that." He paused, then added, "And you will not end up in a workhouse, not if you do not want to." "What choice do I have?" Delilah asked. "I have no family, no money, no home. In 3 days, I will be on the street." Pierce was silent for another moment, and she could almost see him thinking, weighing options in his mind. Then he said something that changed everything. "Come with me." Delilah stared at him. "What?" "Come with me," Pierce repeated. "I have a cabin up in the high country, about 15 miles northwest of here. It is remote, but it is solid and warm. I need someone to help me prepare for winter smoking meat, preserving vegetables, mending clothes, that sort of thing. In exchange, you would have a roof over your head, food, and protection. When spring comes, you can decide what you want to do next." "You cannot be serious," Delilah said, even as hope flickered in her chest. "You do not know anything about me. I could be terrible at all those things you mentioned." "Can you sew?" Pierce asked. "Yes." "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you work hard without complaining?" "I believe so." Pierce nodded. "Then you can do what I need. As for not knowing you, I know enough. I know you have had a terrible day and you need help. I know I have a cabin with plenty of space, and I am tired of spending winters alone talking to myself." He smiled slightly, and the expression transformed his face from intimidating to almost boyish. "I promise you, I am not a madman or a murderer. You can ask around town about me if you want. I have been trading here for years. People know me." "But why?" Delilah asked, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives. "Why would you help a complete stranger?" Pierce looked back at the river, his expression becoming distant. 5 years ago, my sister found herself in a bad situation. No money, no home, pregnant and alone. She was too proud to ask for help, and by the time I found out, it was too late. She died that winter. Her and the baby, both." His jaw tightened. "I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone who needed it, I would. So that is what I am doing." The raw pain in his voice told Delilah he was telling the truth. She studied his profile, the strong nose, the firm set of his mouth, the breadth of his shoulders. Everything about him spoke of strength and capability. But it was the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his sister that convinced her he was genuine. "I would need to be able to leave in the spring if I choose to," she said slowly. "Of course. And I would want your word that you would not expect anything from me beyond the work you mentioned." Pierce turned to look at her, and his expression was serious. "You have my word. I'm offering you help, nothing more. If you want to leave tomorrow, next week, or in the spring, that is your choice. I will not stop you or pressure you." Delilah took a deep breath. It was insane. She had just met this man. She knew nothing about him beyond what he had told her, and he could be lying about all of it. But what other choice did she have? Stay in Salida and face the pity and judgment of the townspeople? Try to make her way to another town with no money and no references? At least with Pierce, she would have food and shelter through the winter, and if he proved to be dangerous or dishonorable, well, she would deal with that if it happened. "When would we leave?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow," Pierce said. "That gives me time to finish my business here, and you time to gather your things and say whatever goodbyes you need to make." Delilah nodded slowly. "All right, I will come with you." Pierce extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip strong but gentle. "Thank you," she said softly. "Do not thank me yet," Pierce replied with a slight smile. "Winters in the high country are not easy. You might curse my name before spring comes." But when he released her hand and stood, offering to walk her back to the boarding house, Delilah felt something she had not felt in months: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there. The next day, Delilah went to see Thomas one final time, not because she wanted to beg him to reconsider, but because she needed to return a few small items he had given her during their courtship. His mother answered the door and looked at her with cold disdain. "Thomas is in the fields," Mrs. Welford said, "but he has nothing more to say to you." "I am not here to talk," Delilah replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "I am here to return these." She held out a small cloth bundle containing a cameo brooch and a book of poetry. Mrs. Welford took the bundle without looking at it. "I heard you were leaving town with that mountain man," she said, her lip curling. "How quickly you move from one man to another. Perhaps it is for the best that Thomas discovered your true nature before making a terrible mistake." The unfairness of the accusation stung, but Delilah refused to let this bitter woman see her pain. "Believe what you want, Mrs. Welford. Your opinion no longer matters to me." She turned and walked away, her spine straight and her head held high. That evening, Pierce came to the boarding house with a sturdy pack horse. Delilah's belongings fit easily into 2 bags. As she tied them to the saddle, Mrs. Patterson came out to watch. "I hope you know what you are doing, child," the older woman said, her expression troubled. "So do I," Delilah admitted. She looked up at Pierce, who sat astride a massive roan horse that looked like it could carry him in his considerable strength without effort. "But I would rather take a chance on kindness than stay here and face cruelty disguised as righteousness." They left Salida as the sun rose the next morning, heading northwest into the mountains. Pierce set a steady pace, not too fast, but not dawdling either. He pointed out landmarks as they rode a distinctive rock formation, a creek that ran year-round, a meadow where elk gathered in the evenings. He was teaching her the way, she realized, so she would know how to get back to town if she needed to. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, the air thinner and cooler. Delilah was not an experienced rider, and by midday her thighs ached and her back was sore. But she did not complain. Pierce called a halt beside a clear stream, helping her down from her horse with careful hands. "We will rest here for a bit," he said, pulling dried meat and bread from his saddlebag. "The worst of the climb is still ahead." As they ate, Delilah studied him more carefully. In the bright mountain sunlight, she could see details she had missed before. Small scars marked his hands and forearms, the kinds of scars a man got from living a hard life in wild places. His clothes were well made but worn, patched in places with careful stitches. He ate efficiently, without waste, like someone accustomed to making supplies last through long winters. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" she asked. "About 6 years," Pierce replied. "I came west after my sister died. Could not stand being around people anymore, all their noise and their judgments. Up here it is just me and the animals and the weather. Simple, honest. Do you ever get lonely?" Pierce considered the question. "Sometimes, but I prefer loneliness to false friendship. At least, loneliness is honest about what it is." He looked at her. "What about you? Did you grow up in Salida?" "No, I came here with my parents when I was 15. My father was a school teacher, and the town needed one. After they died, I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, and I thought I would marry Thomas and make a life here." she smiled bitterly. I suppose fate had other plans. Fate is just another word for the consequences of people's choices, Pierce said. Thomas chose to be a coward. You chose to be brave. That is not fate. That is character. His words warmed something inside her that had been cold since Thomas rejected her. Thank you for saying that. Pierce nodded and stood, extending his hand to help her up. We should keep moving. I want to reach the cabin before dark. The afternoon ride was even more challenging than the morning had been. They followed narrow trails that clung to mountainsides, crossed streams that ran fast and cold, and pushed through stands of pine so thick the ground beneath was carpeted in needles. But the beauty took Delilah's breath away. She had never been this deep into the wilderness before. The mountains rose around them like ancient sentinels, their peaks touched with early snow. Eagles circled overhead, their cries echoing through the valleys. The air smelled of pine and clean water, and something indefinable that she could only think of as freedom. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they emerged into a high valley. A creek ran through its center, and on its banks stood a log cabin. It was larger than Delilah had expected, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A small barn stood nearby, and she could see a garden plot, now mostly harvested, enclosed by a sturdy fence. Home, Pierce said simply, nudging his horse forward. As they drew closer, Delilah could see that the cabin was well maintained. The logs were chinked tight against the weather, the roof looked solid, and the windows had real glass, not just oiled paper. Pierce had clearly put considerable work into making this place livable. He helped her down from her horse, and she bit back a groan as her stiff legs took her weight. Pierce noticed and smiled slightly. First few days are the hardest. Your muscles will adjust. He unsaddled both horses and the pack animal, turning them into a small corral attached to the barn. Delilah took her bags and followed him to the cabin. The door was heavy and hung on iron hinges. Pierce pushed it open and stood aside to let her enter first. The interior was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area beside it. A sturdy table and chairs stood in the center of the room, and shelves lined the walls, holding supplies and equipment. A comfortable-looking bed occupied one corner, piled with furs and woolen blankets. Everything was neat and organized, not what she would have expected from a man living alone. You will take the bed, Pierce said, setting her bags down. I will sleep in the loft. There's a screen you can put around the bed area for privacy. I cannot take your bed, Delilah protested. You can and you will, Pierce said firmly. The agreement was that you would have shelter and safety. That includes a proper bed and privacy. The loft is comfortable enough for me. Delilah wanted to argue further, but the exhaustion of the day was catching up with her, and the bed did look inviting. Thank you, she said instead. Pierce nodded and moved to the fireplace, quickly building a fire with the ease of long practice. There's a spring house just behind the cabin where we keep things cold. I will get some things and make dinner. You should rest. But Delilah shook her head. You offered me work in exchange for shelter. I should start earning my keep. When Pierce looked like he might argue, she added, Please, I need to feel useful. Pierce studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. The kettle is there, the cooking pot is there, and there are vegetables in the bin. Think you can manage a stew while I take care of the horses properly? I can manage. Over the next hour, as Pierce tended to the animals and brought in water from the creek, Delilah explored her new temporary home. She found the cabin surprisingly well stocked. Sacks of flour, cornmeal, and beans lined the shelves. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. There was even a small collection of books on a shelf near the bed. Pierce was clearly a man who planned ahead and took care of his belongings. By the time he returned from the barn, she had a pot of stew simmering over the fire and had found the coffee supplies to brew a pot. Pierce sniffed appreciatively. Smells good, he said, washing his hands in a basin. Better than my usual cooking, that is for certain. They ate at the table, and Delilah realized this was the first meal she had shared with someone that had not been tense or uncomfortable in months. Pierce was an easy companion, not pushing conversation, but not sitting in oppressive silence either. He told her about the valley, about the wildlife she might see, about the rhythms of life in the high country. Winter comes early here and stays late, he explained. We will likely see heavy snow by the end of October. Once it starts, there's no getting down to Salida until spring. That is why we need to work hard these next weeks to make sure we are prepared. What do you need me to do? Delilah asked. Pierce outlined the tasks, finishing the harvest from the garden, preserving everything that could be preserved, checking the cabin for any gaps that needed filling, making sure they had enough firewood to last months, repairing clothing and making new items they would need. It was a daunting list, but Delilah felt energized rather than overwhelmed. This was purposeful work that mattered. That night, Pierce set up the privacy screen around the bed area without being asked. Delilah changed into her nightgown behind it, acutely aware that there was only one door between her and the wilderness, only one man between her and whatever dangers lurked in the darkness. But oddly, she felt safe. Pierce had done everything he promised and nothing he had not. He had been respectful and kind without being overbearing or presumptuous. As she lay in the comfortable bed, listening to Pierce moving quietly around the cabin before climbing to the loft, Delilah thought about how strange life was. Yesterday she had been despairing, certain her life was over. Today she was in a mountain cabin with a man she barely knew, facing a winter in the wilderness. She should be terrified. Instead, she felt more at peace than she had in months. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Pierce and Delilah worked from dawn until dusk, preparing for winter. She discovered she genuinely enjoyed the work. There was satisfaction in hanging vegetables to dry, in packing meat and salt, in seeing the shelves fill with jars of preserves. Pierce was a good teacher, patient and thorough. He showed her how to recognize which wild plants were edible, how to judge weather by the clouds and the wind, how to track animals by their prints in the soft earth by the creek. As they worked side by side, they talked. Pierce told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about following his father into the timber trade, about the accident that killed his father and left Pierce and his sister orphaned. She told him about her parents, about her mother's love of music and her father's passion for teaching, about the wagon accident that took them both when their horses spooked during a thunderstorm. We are both orphans, Delilah observed one afternoon as they worked in the garden, pulling up the last of the root vegetables. Makes us appreciate what we have more, Pierce replied. People who have never lost everything do not understand how precious the simple things are. A warm fire, a good meal, someone to talk to. Delilah looked at him, this strong, capable man kneeling in the dirt beside her, his hands muddy and his hair tied back with a leather cord. Why did you never marry? She asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. I am sorry. That is none of my business. But Pierce did not seem offended. I was engaged once back in Pennsylvania, a girl named Margaret. Pretty, sweet, came from a good family. He pulled up a turnip and tossed it into the basket. But after my father died, and I had to tell her I was going west, she gave me back my ring. Said she could not imagine living anywhere but Philadelphia. Could not imagine a life that was not parties and social calls and pretty dresses. That must have hurt, Delilah said softly. Pierce shrugged. At the time, it did. Now I realize we would have made each other miserable. She would have resented me for taking her away from the life she wanted, and I would have resented her for not being willing to try. He looked at Delilah. Love is not just about feeling something for someone. It is about being willing to weather storms together. Margaret wanted sunshine all the time. Life does not work that way. No, Delilah agreed, thinking of Thomas and how quickly his professed love had evaporated when faced with her inability to bear children. It certainly does not. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Pierce brought out a piece of leather and some tools. I am making new boots for winter, he explained. Mine are getting worn through. Do you know how to work leather? A little, Delilah said. My father's boots were always wearing out. I learned to patch them. Pierce handed her a piece of leather and a needle. Want to practice? We both could use new gloves. As they worked, their hands moving in the warm firelight, Delilah felt something shift inside her. This was comfortable, natural. They worked together well, their rhythms complementary, and she was becoming increasingly aware of Pierce in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude for his help. It was impossible not to notice his physical presence. When he chopped wood, his shirt would stick to his back with sweat, outlining the powerful muscles beneath. When he reached for something on a high shelf, She could see the flex of his arms, the breadth of his shoulders. He moved with a grace surprising in such a large man, economical and sure. And his hands, they were large and scarred, but capable of surprising gentleness. She had seen him handle a newborn rabbit they had found in the garden with such care that it had not even trembled. But it was not just his physical presence that drew her. It was his quiet strength, his steadiness, the way he met challenges without complaint. The way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her thoughts and opinions mattered. The way he smiled sometimes, rare and genuine, transforming his serious face into something that made her heart skip. She was falling for him. The realization hit her one morning as she watched him return from checking his trap lines, his hair loose around his shoulders and a brace of rabbits over his back. She was falling for Pierce Quinlan, this mountain man who had offered her shelter when she had nothing, who had treated her with respect and kindness, who had never once made her feel like she was less because of her barrenness. The thought terrified her. She had been rejected once already. Could she survive it happening again? And why would Pierce want her anyway? He had made it clear their arrangement was simply practical. He needed help preparing for winter, and she needed a place to stay. Nothing more. But sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression in those gray-blue eyes that made her wonder. And sometimes, when their hands brushed accidentally while working, the contact seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary. October arrived, and with it came the first snow. Delilah woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything blanketed in white. Pierce was already up, adding wood to the fire. "Winter's first warning," he said when he saw her looking out the window. "This will melt in a few days, but the real snow is not far behind. We are almost ready, though." They spent that day going through all their preparations, checking and double-checking everything. Pierce pronounced himself satisfied. "We could make it through until March if we had to," he said. "Longer if we are careful." That evening, Delilah made a special dinner to celebrate being prepared roasted venison with wild onions and the last of the fresh vegetables from the garden. Pierce had surprised her by producing a bottle of whiskey from somewhere. "Been saving this," he admitted, pouring a small amount into 2 tin cups. "Figured completing our preparations was worth celebrating." The whiskey burned going down but warmed her belly. They sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, and Delilah thought how strange it was that she felt safer and happier here, in a cabin miles from civilization, than she had ever felt in town. "Hey, thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. For taking a chance on a stranger. For giving me a place to be when I had nowhere else to go." Pierce looked at her over his cup, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "I should be thanking you. This cabin feels more like a home in the few weeks you have been here than it has in all the years I have lived in it." Something in his tone made Delilah's breath catch. "Pierce." "I know what I said when I offered you this arrangement," Pierce interrupted, setting down his cup. "I know I promised nothing more than shelter and work, but I would be lying if I said that was all I felt now." Delilah's heart hammered in her chest. "What are you saying?" Pierce stood and moved to the window, his back to her. "I'm saying that somewhere between teaching you to recognize elk tracks and watching you laugh at the antics of the camp robbers, I started feeling things I had not felt in years, maybe ever." He turned to face her. "I'm saying that you are not just someone I offered help to anymore. You are someone I look forward to seeing every morning, someone whose opinions I value, someone I want to protect and care for, not out of obligation, but because the thought of anything hurting you makes me want to tear mountains apart." Delilah stood on shaking legs. "But I am barren," she whispered. "I cannot give you children. I cannot give you sons to carry on your name." Pierce crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just in front of her. "Do you really think I care about that?" His voice was intense, passionate. "Delilah, I do not need children to make my life meaningful. I do not need sons to validate my existence, but I find that I need you. These past weeks, watching you work beside me, listening to you talk, seeing your strength and your courage, you have planted something in me I thought was dead." Tears spilled down Delilah's cheeks. "Thomas said I was barren ground, that nothing could grow in me." Pierce cupped her face gently in his large hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Then Thomas was a fool who did not know how to cultivate what mattered. Delilah, you are not barren. Your heart is rich soil, and love grows there in abundance. I have seen how you care for things, the way you nursed that injured bird back to health, the way you talk to the horses, the way you have made this cabin beautiful with small touches I never thought to add. You have the capacity for so much love. The fact that it might not produce children does not diminish it. You truly do not care? Delilah asked, needing to hear it again, needing to believe it. I truly do not care, Pierce said firmly. I want you, Delilah Ashford, not your womb, not your ability to bear children. You, your smile, your laughter, your sharp mind and kind heart. I want to wake up every morning and see you across the breakfast table. I want to work beside you through the day and sit with you by the fire at night. I want to hold you when you are sad and celebrate with you when you are happy. I want to build a life with you, whatever that life looks like. I want that too, Delilah whispered. I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. But I have been falling for you since that first night by the river. Maybe even since the moment you looked at me like I was worth something when everyone else had decided I was not. Pierce bent his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Delilah did not want to pull away. She rose on her toes to meet him, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Then, Pierce's arms came around her, pulling her against his solid warmth, and Delilah wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in his long hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this right, he said. I want to court you properly. I want you to be sure this is what you want. I am sure, Delilah said, but I appreciate that you want to take time. We have all winter after all. Pierce smiled, that rare, wonderful smile that transformed his face. That we do. The next weeks were the happiest of Delilah's life. Pierce courted her with a thoughtfulness that touched her deeply. He brought her wildflowers that somehow still bloomed in sheltered spots. He carved her a beautiful comb for her hair. He played a battered harmonica in the evenings, filling the cabin with surprisingly sweet music. He told her stories of his adventures in the mountains, and she told him about her childhood dreams and aspirations. They worked together during the day and sat together by the fire at night. Pierce never pushed for more than she was ready to give, but their kisses grew longer and deeper, and Delilah found herself craving his touch, the solid warmth of his body against hers. The heavy snows came in late October, just as Pierce had predicted. The world became a white wilderness, beautiful and dangerous. They were completely snowed in, cut off from the outside world. But Delilah did not mind. The cabin was warm and cozy, their supplies were plentiful, and she had Pierce. One night in early November, as they lay together on the bed, they had abandoned the pretense of separate sleeping areas weeks ago. Though Pierce had been a perfect gentleman, Delilah traced the scars on his arms. How did you get these? She asked. Pierce took her hand and kissed her fingertips. Different times, different circumstances. This one, he indicated a long scar on his forearm, is from a mountain lion that took exception to me checking my traps in what he considered his territory. This one, a puckered mark on his shoulder, is from a bullet, got caught in the middle of a dispute between two miners over a claim. This one, he showed her his palm, is from when I was young and stupid and grabbed a hot poker without thinking. You have lived such a dangerous life, Delilah said softly. That is the mountain way, Pierce replied. But it is an honest life. The dangers are real, not hidden behind smiles and social niceties. He pulled her closer. I am careful, Delilah. I have survived this long because I do not take foolish chances. I plan to survive much longer so I can spend my life with you. Promise me, Delilah said urgently. Promise me you will always come back to me. I promise, Pierce said solemnly. I will always come back to you. In mid-November, Pierce asked her to marry him. They were standing outside the cabin in the bright afternoon sun, surrounded by snow that glittered like diamonds. The sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the mountains rose around them in stark white beauty. I do not have a ring, Pierce said, taking her hands in his, but I have a heart that is completely yours. Delilah Ashford, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Delilah said, joy flooding through her. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Pierce swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Delilah felt like her heart might burst from happiness. "We will have to wait until spring to make it legal," Pierce said. "We cannot get down to Salida for a proper ceremony until the snow melts. But I want you to know, in my heart, you are already my wife." "And you are already my husband," Delilah replied. That night, their relationship changed. Pierce carried her to the bed and laid her down gently, his eyes asking permission. Delilah nodded, reaching for him, and he came to her with a tenderness that made her want to weep. He was so careful with her, so attentive to her needs, his strong hands gentle as he helped her out of her clothes and then removed his own. In the firelight, his body was magnificent, all hard muscle and masculine power. Delilah traced the contours of his chest, marveling at the strength contained in his frame. Pierce shuddered at her touch, his eyes darkening with desire. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I have never been more sure of anything," Delilah replied. Pierce made love to her slowly, thoroughly, bringing her to heights of pleasure she had never imagined possible. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Delilah felt tears on her cheeks. "Did I hurt you?" Pierce asked immediately, pulling back to look at her face. "No," Delilah assured him, pulling him back down. "I am just happy. So impossibly happy. I never thought I would feel this way. I never thought anyone would want me like this." Pierce kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then they were all fools. You are a treasure, Delilah. My treasure." Winter deepened, and the cabin became their entire world. They made love and they talked and they worked on small projects to pass the time. Pierce taught Delilah to play the harmonica, and though she was terrible at it, he always praised her efforts. She taught him to cook dishes her mother had made, and he ate everything she prepared with enthusiasm. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply. Delilah had secretly been knitting Pierce a warm scarf from some yarn she had found in the cabin supplies. Pierce surprised her with a beautifully carved jewelry box, its lid inlaid with different colored woods to create a mountain scene. "When did you make this?" Delilah asked, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "When I was supposed to be checking the trap lines," Pierce admitted with a grin. "I would find a sheltered spot and work on it for a while before heading back." "It is beautiful," Delilah said, overwhelmed by the thought and effort he had put into it. "Not as beautiful as you," Pierce replied, and kissed her. January and February passed in a blur of snow and cold and warmth inside the cabin. They played cards and read books aloud to each other. Pierce carved kitchen utensils while Delilah sewed new clothes. They planned what they would do in the spring, how they would expand the garden, maybe add a chicken coop, possibly build an addition to the cabin. "We could have a real bedroom," Pierce suggested, "with a door and everything, and use the main room just for living and cooking." "That would be nice," Delilah agreed, "and maybe we could get some laying hens. I miss having fresh eggs." They talked about whether to stay in the mountains or move to town eventually. Delilah admitted she preferred the mountains. "There is a freedom here I never felt in Salida," she explained. "No one judging me, no one gossiping. Just us in the wilderness." "We could compromise," Pierce suggested. "Spend most of the year here but go down to town a few times for supplies and to maintain some connection with civilization. The best of both worlds." As March arrived and the first signs of spring began to appear, they made preparations for the trip to Salida. The snow was melting rapidly, and soon the route would be passable. "Are you ready to face them?" Pierce asked. "There will be talk. You know there will be." "Let them talk," Delilah said firmly. "I know who I am now. I know my worth. I am not the same woman who left last September." They made the journey to Salida in early April, the mountains showing green in the lower elevations while snow still capped the high peaks. As they rode into town, Delilah saw people stop and stare. She sat straighter in her saddle, meeting their gazes directly. They went straight to the church, where Reverend Michaels looked surprised to see them but recovered quickly. "Miss Ashford," he said, "Mr. Quinlan, how can I help you?" "We would like to be married," Pierce said, his hand finding Delilah's. "Today, if possible." The Reverend looked between them, then smiled. "I think that can be arranged. Do you have witnesses?" Mrs. Patterson happened to be at the church arranging flowers. Despite their awkward parting, she agreed to stand as a witness, as did Mr. Chen, who ran the general store and had always been kind to Delilah. Word spread quickly, and by the time the ceremony was ready to begin, a small crowd had gathered. Thomas was not among them. but his mother was. Mrs. Welford stood at the back of the church, her face set in disapproving lines. Delilah ignored her, focusing instead on Pierce, magnificent in a clean shirt with his hair tied back, his eyes full of love as he looked at her. Reverend Michaels performed a simple but beautiful ceremony. When it came time to exchange vows, Pierce's voice was strong and sure. I, Pierce Matthew Quinlan, take you, Delilah Rose Ashford, to be my wife. I promise to love you, honor you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. You are my heart, my home, my everything. Delilah's voice shook with emotion as she replied, I, Delilah Rose Ashford, take you, Pierce Matthew Quinlan, to be my husband. I promise to love you, honor you, support you, and stand beside you through all of life's trials and joys. You saw worth in me when others saw only lack. You planted love where others said nothing could grow. I will spend my life proving that their barren ground is your fertile soil. There was not a dry eye in the church. Even Mrs. Patterson was dabbing at her face with her handkerchief. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Pierce kissed her thoroughly to the applause of the onlookers. After the ceremony, Mrs. Patterson approached them. I owe you an apology, she said to Delilah. I was unkind when you needed kindness most. I let the opinions of others influence me when I should have stood by my own judgment. You were always a good girl, and I'm sorry I turned you out. Thank you, Delilah said, squeezing the older woman's hand. But perhaps it was for the best. If I had not been desperate, I might never have taken the chance that led me to Pierce. They stayed in town only long enough to record the marriage officially and to purchase a few supplies. As they were loading the pack horse, Thomas appeared. He looked thinner than Delilah remembered, his face drawn. Delilah, he said, his eyes flicking nervously to Pierce's imposing presence. I heard you got married. I wanted to say I am sorry for how I treated you. It was wrong. Delilah studied him for a moment. She felt no anger, no bitterness, only pity for this man who had let fear and social pressure override his heart. Thank you for saying so, Thomas. I hope you find happiness. I hope you have too, Thomas said. It looks like you have. I have, Delilah confirmed, taking Pierce's hand, more than I ever dreamed possible. They left Salida behind and returned to their mountain home. Over the next weeks, they worked on the additions they had planned. Pierce proved to be a skilled carpenter, and with Delilah's help, they built a separate bedroom and a small structure that would house chickens once they brought some up from town. Spring turned to summer, and the high valley exploded with wildflowers. Delilah tended her expanded garden while Pierce checked his trap lines and hunted. They fell into comfortable rhythms, each instinctively knowing what the other needed. One evening in July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Delilah said, I want to do something. What is that? Pierce asked, his arm around her shoulders. I want to help other women who find themselves in difficult situations. Women like I was desperate, alone, facing judgment for things beyond their control. She turned to look at him. What if we offered our home as a refuge, not permanently, but as a stopping place? A place where women could catch their breath, regain their strength, and figure out what to do next. Pierce was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he nodded. I think that is a wonderful idea. We have room and we have resources. And you know better than anyone what it feels like to need help and have nowhere to turn. So they began. Word spread slowly at first, through the Reverend and Mrs. Patterson and others who knew sympathetic people. Over the next few years, several women found their way to the cabin in the mountains. A young widow with 2 small children who needed somewhere to stay while she arranged to move to family in California. A woman fleeing an abusive husband who needed time to plan her next steps. A pregnant girl abandoned by her family who stayed through the winter and then decided to keep her baby and make a new start in Denver. Delilah and Pierce helped them all, offering not just shelter but genuine care and support. Some stayed only a few weeks, others several months. All of them left stronger and more confident, ready to face whatever came next. Pierce proved to be wonderful with the children who sometimes came with the women. He would carve them toys and teach them to fish in the creek and tell them stories. Watching him with the children, Delilah sometimes felt a pang of sorrow that they would never have any of their own. But then Pierce would look at her with such love in his eyes that the sorrow would fade. They had each other. They had their life in the mountains. They had the satisfaction of helping others. It was enough. It was more than enough. 5 years after their marriage, in the spring of 1879, they were in Salida buying supplies when a young boy approached them. He was perhaps 7 years old, thin and ragged, with intelligent dark eyes and brown hair that badly needed cutting. "Excuse me, sir, madam," the boy said politely. "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Quinlan?" "We are," Pierce confirmed. "Who are you, son?" "My name is Samuel. I've been living at the orphanage, but they say I'm too old now and I need to find work or they cannot keep me anymore." The boy straightened his shoulders, trying to look bigger and stronger than he was. "I am a hard worker. I do not eat much, and I am good with animals and fixing things. The Reverend said you might need help sometimes, up at your place in the mountains." Delilah and Pierce exchanged a long look. Without speaking aloud, they communicated volumes. Then Delilah knelt down to the boy's level. "When did you last eat, Samuel?" she asked gently. The boy's thin facade of bravery cracked. "Yesterday morning, madam. They only feed the children who are still officially at the orphanage. Since I am supposed to be leaving, they said I am not entitled to meals anymore." Fury rose in Delilah's chest, but she kept her voice calm. "Well, we cannot have that. Come with us. We will get you some food, and then we can talk about what comes next." At the hotel restaurant, they watched Samuel devour a meal with the desperation of someone who had gone hungry too often. Delilah had to remind him several times to slow down so he would not make himself sick. When the boy had finally eaten his fill and was sipping at a cup of milk, Pierce said, "Samuel, my wife and I live in the mountains. It is hard work, and it can be lonely sometimes being so far from town. But there's always enough food, a warm bed, and honest labor. We could use someone to help with the animals in the garden and other tasks around the place. If you are willing to work hard and learn, we would be willing to give you a home." Samuel's eyes went wide. "You mean it? A real home?" "A real home," Delilah confirmed, "for as long as you want it." The boy started to cry, great heaving sobs that shook his thin frame. Delilah pulled him into her arms, and he clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had proven unstable and cruel. "It's all right," she murmured, stroking his hair. "You are safe now. We will take care of you." Pierce reached over and put his large hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of protection and promise. In that moment, Delilah realized that their family had just grown, not through birth but through choice, and her heart felt so full she thought it might overflow. They took Samuel back to the mountains with them. At first, the boy was hesitant, as if waiting for them to change their minds or reveal some cruel trick. But gradually, as the days passed and Pierce and Delilah showed him nothing but kindness and patience, Samuel began to relax. He proved to be exactly what he had claimed, a hard worker, quick to learn and good with animals. He also proved to be intelligent and curious. Delilah began teaching him to read and write properly, something the orphanage had neglected. Pierce taught him woodcraft and how to survive in the mountains. The boy soaked up knowledge like a dry sponge, finally finding water. One night, about a month after Samuel had come to live with them, he asked, "Why did you take me in? You did not know me. You did not know if I would be worth the trouble." Pierce and Delilah were sitting by the fire with Samuel between them. Pierce put down the leather he had been working and looked at the boy seriously. "Because we know what it is like to be judged for things beyond your control," he said. "We know what it is like to be seen as less than, or unwanted, or inconvenient, and we know how much it means when someone offers you a chance." "Are you going to send me away if I do something wrong?" Samuel asked, his voice small. "No," Delilah said firmly. "Samuel, this is your home now. You are not a hired hand or a temporary guest. You are part of this family. That means when you make mistakes, and you will, because everyone does, we help you learn from them. It does not mean we cast you out." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I call you Ma and Pa? I know you are not my real parents, but—" "We would be honored," Pierce said, his voice rough with emotion. "Very honored," Delilah added, pulling the boy into a hug. Samuel flourished over the next years. He grew tall and strong, though he never quite matched Pierce's impressive size. He learned everything Pierce could teach him about living in the mountains, and he absorbed all the knowledge Delilah offered about reading, writing, and arithmetic. By the time he was 12, he was reading books that would challenge many adults. They continued their practice of offering refuge to women in need, and Samuel proved to be wonderful with the temporary residents. He was courteous and helpful without being intrusive, and the children who came through absolutely adored him. One day, when Samuel was 15, he asked Pierce, "Do you ever regret that you do not have children of your own? Real children, I mean." They were mending fence together, and Pierce stopped his work to look at the young man Samuel was becoming. "You are my real child," he said. "Maybe I did not plant the seed that made you, but I have helped cultivate the man you are becoming. That is what matters." "Ma cannot have children," Samuel said. It was not a question. He had figured it out over the years from careful comments and observations. "That is true," Pierce confirmed, "and it caused her great pain once, being judged as less because of it. But Samuel, some people think the only way to build a family is through blood. They are wrong. Family is built through love, through choice, through showing up every day and doing the work. Your mother and I may not have made you in the traditional way, but you are ours just as surely as if we had." Samuel nodded, blinking back tears. "I love you, Pa, and I love Ma. I just wanted you to know that." Pierce pulled the boy into a rough hug. "We love you too, son, more than you know." Years continued to pass. Samuel grew into a fine young man, eventually deciding he wanted to study law. Pierce and Delilah, who had prospered through careful management of their resources and Pierce's trapping business, helped fund his education. He went to Denver to attend school, but he came back to the mountains every summer, and he never forgot where he came from or who had given him a chance when no one else would. When Samuel was 22, he brought a young woman home to meet his parents. Her name was Grace, and she was a teacher. She looked at the mountain cabin in the wild country with delight rather than dismay, and she listened with rapt attention as Delilah told her about their work helping women in need. "I would love to help with that," Grace said. "I have encountered so many women in difficult circumstances in my teaching. It would be wonderful to have a place to send them, somewhere safe where they could figure out their next steps." Samuel married Grace that summer in a ceremony at the cabin. Reverend Michaels, now quite elderly, made the trip up to perform the service. Mrs. Patterson came too, along with several other friends Pierce and Delilah had made over the years. As Delilah watched Samuel and Grace exchange vows, Pierce's arm around her waist, she thought about that desperate day by the river in Salida when she had believed her life was over. She thought about Thomas Welford, who had called her barren ground and rejected her. She wondered if he had found happiness, and she hoped he had, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had found hers. Pierce must have sensed her thoughts because he pulled her closer and whispered in her ear, "What are you thinking about?" "About how wrong everyone was," Delilah whispered back. "Thomas said I was barren ground, that nothing could grow in me. But look at all of this." She gestured to Samuel and Grace, to the gathered friends, to the life they had built. "We may not have children in the traditional sense, but we have created life nonetheless. We have nurtured growth. We have planted love in places everyone else said were barren, and look how it has flourished." Pierce kissed her temple. "You were never barren, my love. You just needed someone who understood how to cultivate what mattered. And I needed someone to teach me that strength comes in many forms and family can be built in many ways." They were in their 50s now, their hair touched with gray, their faces lined with years of mountain weather. But their love had only deepened with time, growing richer and more complex like good soil that has been carefully tended. Samuel and Grace moved into a house in Denver, where Samuel practiced law and Grace taught school. But they visited often, and when they had children, 3 in total, those children spent their summers in the mountains with their grandparents, learning the same lessons Samuel had learned about resilience and kindness and the importance of helping those in need. Pierce and Delilah continued their work, helping women who needed refuge. They became known throughout the region as people who could be trusted, who would help without judgment. Some of the women they helped kept in touch over the years, sending letters about their new lives and their successes. Each letter was a treasure that Delilah saved in the beautiful jewelry box Pierce had made her so many years ago. When Pierce was 65, he started to slow down a bit. The years of hard mountain living had taken their toll on his body, though he was still strong and capable. Delilah noticed him rubbing his knee sometimes after a long day, or taking a bit longer to rise in the morning. "Maybe we should think about moving to town," she suggested one evening. "We have done our work here. Perhaps it is time for an easier life." But Pierce shook his head. "These mountains are my home, our home. I will leave them when they carry me out, and not before." Delilah understood. She felt the same way. The cabin had been expanded multiple times over the years. It was comfortable and beautiful, filled with memories of the life they had built together. Why would they leave? They continued on, adjusting their pace, but not their purpose. They still took in women who needed help, though they were more selective now, accepting only situations where their particular skills and resources could make a real difference. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Samuel organized a party at the cabin. All their extended family came, Samuel and Grace with their 3 children, now teenagers themselves. Several of the women they had helped over the years made the journey, wanting to thank the couple who had changed their lives. Mrs. Patterson, now ancient but still sharp, came up from Salida with the current Reverend Michaels, having passed on several years earlier. It was a joyous celebration, full of laughter and stories and love. As Delilah looked around at all the people gathered in and around their cabin, she was overwhelmed with gratitude. This was her legacy. Not children born from her body, but lives touched, futures changed, love planted in barren ground and growing into something beautiful. Pierce found her on the porch, looking out at the mountains bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back into his solid warmth. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Quinlan," he murmured. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Quinlan," she replied. 30 years, can you believe it?" "Best 30 years of my life," Pierce said. "You know, I think about that night by the river sometimes. How close you came to giving up. How close I came to just walking away without speaking to you. What if I had not stopped? What if you had not agreed to come with me?" "But you did stop," Delilah said, "and I did come with you. That is what matters. Not the what-ifs, but what actually happened." "What actually happened is that I found the love of my life when I was not even looking for it," Pierce said. "What actually happened is that Thomas Welford's cruelty became the catalyst for our happiness. What actually happened is that supposed barren ground produced the most abundant harvest imaginable." Delilah turned in his arms to face him. His hair was mostly gray now, and deep lines bracketed his eyes and mouth. But those gray-blue eyes still looked at her with the same love and intensity they had shown that first night by the river 30 years ago. "I love you," she said simply. "I loved you then. I love you now. And I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Pierce replied. "You were never barren, Delilah. You were just waiting for the right person to see your true worth, and I will spend every remaining day I have showing you that worth, celebrating it, and thanking God or fate or whatever force brought you into my life." He kissed her then, and even after 30 years of marriage, Delilah felt the same flutter in her chest, the same sense of coming home that she had felt the first time his lips touched hers. They lived many more years in their mountain cabin. Pierce passed first at the age of 73, peacefully in his sleep after a full day of working in the garden he still insisted on maintaining. Delilah grieved deeply, but she also celebrated the incredible life they had shared. She stayed in the mountains, in the cabin they had built together, supported by Samuel and Grace and their children, who visited frequently and made sure she was never alone for long. Delilah lived to be 80, still sharp-minded and active until nearly the end. On her last day, surrounded by her family, she looked around at Samuel and Grace, at the grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren who had been enriched by her presence in their lives, and she smiled. "Tell them," she whispered to Samuel, her voice weak but content. "Tell them that worth is not measured by what you can produce, but by how you love. Tell them that barren ground is just ground that has not been properly cultivated with the right kind of love. Tell them that family is not just blood, but choice and commitment and showing up every day." "I will, Ma," Samuel promised, tears streaming down his face. "I will tell them. Your story will not be forgotten." Delilah closed her eyes, and her last thoughts were of Pierce, his strength, his kindness, his unwavering love. She remembered that first night by the river when he had offered her hope when she had none. She remembered their wedding day, their first winter together, the day they brought Samuel home, all the women they had helped, all the love they had planted in ground that others had deemed barren. Thomas Welford had been wrong. She had not been barren ground. She had been rich soil waiting for the right gardener, and Pierce Quinlan had been that gardener. Together, they had grown something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of love that would continue through generations. And in the end, that was worth more than all the children in the world. The cabin in the mountains became something of a legend in the region. Samuel and Grace maintained it, eventually passing it down to their children with instructions that it should always be kept as a refuge for those in need. For decades after Delilah's death, women in difficult circumstances found their way to that cabin and found help, continuing the work that Pierce and Delilah had started. On a shelf in the main room, carefully preserved, sat the jewelry box Pierce had carved for Delilah so many years ago. Inside were letters, photographs, and small mementos of all the lives that had been touched by their love. It was a testament to the truth that barren ground was only barren until someone with vision and love decided to plant something there. And what Pierce and Delilah had planted, hope, compassion, and unconditional love, had grown into a garden that flourished long after they were gone. Proof that the most fertile ground is the human heart, and the most abundant harvest is love shared freely with those who need it most. Their story became part of the family lore, passed down from generation to generation. Great-great-grandchildren who never met Pierce and Delilah grew up hearing about the mountain man who had seen worth in a rejected woman, and the woman who had proven that value is inherent and not contingent on meeting society's narrow expectations. In Salida, a historical marker was eventually placed near where the boarding house once stood, commemorating the place where Delilah Ashford had faced her darkest moment before finding her greatest happiness. The inscription read simply, "From this place of despair, Delilah Ashford began a journey that proved love grows best in hearts willing to receive it, regardless of society's judgments. May we all remember that every person has worth, and what seems barren often holds the potential for the most abundant harvest." And so the story of Pierce and Delilah lived on, a reminder that rejection can be the beginning of something better, that true love sees worth where others see lack, and that the most barren ground can become the most fertile soil when tended with patience, kindness, and unwavering devotion. Their legacy was not measured in biological children, but in changed lives, in hope restored, in love planted where others said nothing could grow, proving once and for all that the human capacity for love and growth is limitless when given the chance to flourish.